The COVID-19 lockdown imposed in March brought the entire country to a standstill, causing massive widespread economic disaster. I've already done a video on how the overall GDP growth of India fell close to 24% in the first quarter of this year. Think of this video as going deeper into the economic situation of our country. The lockdown sent budgets across households in the country for a toss. But you know what went pretty much under the radar? The fact that budgets of our governments, both center and state, went for a toss as well. That's right, our governments are kind of broke and scrambling to figure out how to recover from this mess. And one big indicator of this was the drop in income from the goods and service tax, GST. Yaar, I'm so worried about my personal budget. I don't have money to buy a car, a house, an iPhone. And you want me to worry about the government's budget also? Matlab, it's so complicated. Matlab, kuch bhi. Matlab, why? That's true. It's काफी complicated. But it's important for you to know about the mess in our government finances because ultimately it is going to bite all of us in the backside. So in this video, allow me to break down why we should be paying close attention to the government finances and how it affects you. Let's get right into it. Okay, so let's start from the basics. How does the government earn paisa? The answer is taxes. In February this year, the Income Tax Department said that 1.46 crore people in India are liable to pay income tax. So in a country of 130 crore people, that comes to about 1.5% of the population. This also gives them the special right to go on social media sites and say, "You see my sweet summer child? I pay taxes. I have a right to criticize this government. What do? You endlessly sit on the computer and criticize endlessly. But what right do you have? I pay taxes." Well, newsflash. You, my dear pompous income tax paying friend, are wrong. Everyone pays taxes. It's called indirect tax. So whether you like it or not, the government is taking your money. And that is what we are going to talk about today. In April 2017, the Modi government took the truly revolutionary step of bringing in a new indirect tax regime called the Goods and Service Tax or GST. Before this came in, the system of indirect tax was a hodgepodge of several taxes levied by both the central and state governments. These taxes were also levied at different stages in the market. For example, excise was levied by the state governments at the time of manufacturing and value added tax VAT was levied at the time of consumption. For services, the central government charged a separate service tax. So yeah, it was a mess. GST was introduced to sort it all out. The one big change it brought about was that this tax was now levied at the incidence of consumption, meaning the consumer will pay tax only when buying the final product or service. Remember this point because it's important. Now before GST happened, state governments were also imposing a lot of taxes on their own. For example, Kerala actually imposed a fat tax on burgers, pizzas, donuts and tacos served in branded restaurants. This was done to make fast food more expensive and reduce obesity in the state. This was also done because communism. Anyway, GST ended all of that. Except for petrol and alcohol, everything else was brought under a single tax regime across the country, which is GST, and 50% of the collections went to the states. The rate of tax on goods and services are now determined by the GST Council, which is applicable across the country. So, to put it simply, GST is a tax which is completely and utterly dependent on one thing: economic success. No, seriously, the more products and services sold, the more indirect tax the government earns. And when the pandemic hit, well, you can guess what happened. Pura kachra ho gaya. In August, the government issued a statement showing exactly how much kachra ho gaya. Oh, it was bad. Just look at this chart. In April last year, the GST collection was over 1,13,000 crore. That dropped to 32,000 crore in a snap. It has taken us 6 whole months to come back to collections of over 1 lakh crore again. The good news is, latest figures in October show that we are on the path to recovery. So yay, sab changezi. But wait, it's not that simple. It's really not. You see, during the last 6 months, the income for the government did drop, but the expenses didn't. In fact, because of a raging pandemic, states had to spend a lot of money on an emergency basis on hospitals and equipment, testing facilities, security deployment to ensure order, and much more. Remember when I told you GST took away the powers of the state to impose their own taxes, like the VAT tax? Yeah. This meant that during the pandemic, state governments became quite dependent on the central government for money. And even before the lockdown started, the central government had pending payments. Okay, now bear with me because this is where complications really start. You see, when GST was implemented back in 2017, some states were not very happy. While rich states like Maharashtra, Delhi, Telangana could get paisa and self-sustain, there were poor states like Bihar, Nagaland, Odisha which could not. And GST took away their powers to impose taxes. Plus, there was this thing about the incidence of tax. Now, since the tax was levied at consumption point, states that consumed more stuff naturally got more paisa, as opposed to those that manufactured stuff. Some state governments thought this would be quite unfair. So, a compromise was made. The central government said that all the losses that states were making due to the new tax regime would be paid through a special cess. Meaning, for 5 years after 2017, the central government would collect some extra money over and above the usual GST and give it to the states till 2022. This was done according to the 14% compounded interest formula, which we are not going to get into because maths. Goddamn maths. I hate it. Just not happening. Having said that, let's talk numbers. Between financial year 2017 and 2019, the cess collection by the central government was far more than the actual compensation paid to state governments. There was a surplus of more than 47,000 crore which was yet to be paid. Cut to April 2020, due to the economic slowdown and some effect of the lockdown in March, the central government had to pay more than 1,65,000 crore as compensation against a collection of 95,000 crore. So, even after using the earlier surplus, there was still a shortfall of more than 22,000 crore rupees. It doesn't end there because there was already a significant delay in paying states their earlier dues. The compensation for October-November 2019 was disbursed in April 2020 and the money from December to February 2020 was paid in June 2020, a delay of 4 months each time. So yeah, in toto, the center owed a lot of money to state governments just as the pandemic hit. Plus, there was already a delay in past payments. And on top of it, the economy came to a sudden standstill. So, there was very little GST revenue being collected after April. According to the reply by the Finance Ministry in Parliament, the compensation due to the states for the month of April to July 2020 was 1.51 lakh crore rupees. This amount is almost the same amount of compensation given to the states for the entirety of financial year 2019-20. Yeah. So, where we are right now is essentially this. Right, so broke governments at the center and state are kind of scrambling to get money to meet expenses. As I said earlier, the situation does seem to be improving, thankfully, but the last 6 months have piled up a whole lot of extra debt. What is the solution to all of this? After the 43rd GST Council meeting, which was held on October 12th, it was decided that the central government will be borrowing money and providing loans to the state amounting to 1.1 lakh crore rupees. Additionally, the 5-year cess collection window might be extended beyond June 2022 to recover COVID-19 related loss of revenue. As of recording this, the center has facilitated borrowings worth 12,000 crore rupees. So, how will this affect you? It's not that hard to figure out. The tax money governments collect is used on two things. 1. Capital expenditure, meaning spending on long-term stuff like building roads, railway networks, facilitating housing, urban development, etc. Essentially, building up the machine. And number 2, revenue expenditure, meaning spending on short-term stuff like salaries, day-to-day expenses, rent, interest, utilities, etc. These are expenses which are done to keep the machine running. If a government has less money, they stop capital expenditure and just focus on revenue expenditure, because they might not be able to build the machine up more, upgrade it, make it cooler, but at least they can keep the existing one running. So in a situation like right now, we should see cutbacks in infrastructure projects, less spending on government welfare programs and some such. And this might continue beyond this year, way past 2022 even. To recap, here is what is happening. The government earns a bunch of money from GST, which is an indirect tax that everyone has to pay. The GST collection is completely dependent on the economic situation. More economic activity leads to more GST collection. GST makes the state government dependent on the central government for revenue. Now, when the pandemic hit, the central government was already holding back a bunch of money, which they had collected as compensation cess. When lockdown happened, economic activity dropped, tax revenue went down, and the surplus just kind of vanished. Now the central government owes a lot of money to the states for these past few months, money that it does not have. This will force them to extend the GST compensation to states deadline from the earlier 5 years to who knows when. That would eat at their long-term revenue. And all of this would ultimately force governments to spend less on creating capital and more on running the existing government machinery with whatever money they have. Things do seem to be improving, not going to lie. GST revenue is the best indicator and the first indicator of how the economy is doing, even better than the GDP growth figures, I'd say. There will be a recovery, but it will take some time. So hunker down and keep a watch on those tax revenues of the government. And if you think it's too complicated, which it really is, तो guys, अभी हम जिंदा है.